The Logic View is a Class II biosafety enclosure designed specifically for large laboratory instruments such as liquid handlers and cell sorters. In this video, we will cover how to unpack, assemble, and install the Logic View. Prior to unpacking the enclosure, verify that the installation site and the pathway into the lab are compatible with the dimensions of the Logic View. To complete the installation, you will need the following tools: a box knife, a flathead screwdriver, a number 2 Phillips screwdriver, a socket set or a drill and socket bits, a crowbar and hammer, a carpenter's level, and your user's manual on a USB drive. In addition to this video, the manual contains a detailed step-by-step explanation for the entire installation process. After receiving the Logic View, be sure to inspect for shipping damage before and during the unpacking process. If damage is present, notify the delivery carrier immediately. Begin by removing the protective skeletal crating around the Logic View. Remove all exterior boards, taking care to watch for staples exposed once the boards are removed. Retain this packaging, as well as packaging from upcoming steps, until all units have been checked, installed, and tested. Remove the shrink wrap. And remove the sash brackets and foam pads. Start with the lower screws and support the piece when removing the final screw. Set aside the scissor jack box, the parts box, which contains the enclosure's leveling feet, the pallet ramp, secured with 4 screws, which must be retained, and the white parts box from within the enclosure. If any parts are missing, contact Labconco for assistance. Remove the 2 top frame brackets by removing the 4 bolts on each top frame bracket. Discard the top frame brackets, protective white pads, and bolts. Reinstall the 2 lower end panels. Next, remove the jack from its box and assemble it. Begin the next step by chalking the wheels on one side of the Logic View. Carefully place the provided scissor jack under the center lateral strut on the opposite side of the enclosure. Then raise the jack until it makes contact with the Logic View's frame. Remove the 2 lag bolts and washers from the bottom frame bracket on the end where the scissor jack is located. Continue raising the scissor jack until the weight of the enclosure is off the bottom frame bracket. Remove the bracket. Discard it and the hardware. Carefully lower the scissor jack until the casters bear the weight of the enclosure. Repeat this procedure for the opposite end. Next, place the pallet ramp on one end of the pallet. The long chamfer on the pallet ramp should rest against the floor. Secure the ramp to the pallet by reusing the 4 screws that originally secured the pallet ramp in place for shipment. Run the 4 screws through the holes in the ramp's top flange. Using at least 2 people, carefully and slowly roll the enclosure off the pallet and down the ramp until it rests securely on the floor. The Logic View can now be moved to its final installation location. If the pathway into the lab does not involve short or narrow doorways, you can skip ahead to complete the installation. Passage through some doorways may require removal of the Logic View's top section. As shipped, the Logic View is 94.5 inches tall and can be lowered to 93.5 inches by lowering the integral base stand. However, the top of the Logic View may be removed to reduce the overall height to 77.5 inches. To prepare the Logic View to pass through low doors, you'll need the following tools: a number 2 Phillips screwdriver. A drill is recommended. A 5/16 wrench and a 5/16 nut driver. a 1/2-inch wrench and a 1/2-inch ratcheting socket, and a step ladder. Remove the plate screws and cap plates from the top of the enclosure. Then, lift off the top panel and pre-filter. Remove the 3 front screws on each end of the upper front panel. Then remove the 2 top screws on the far right and left end of the upper front panel. Next, tilt the upper front panel away from the enclosure and lift the panel off. Repeat these instructions for the upper rear panel. Next, remove the 2 screws on each end panel. Rotate the top of each end panel away from the enclosure, then lift each panel up to completely remove it. Next, disconnect all wiring connectors from the electrical box. Note the 2 connectors on the rear face of the box. Disconnect them as well. The relay cables must be removed using a jeweler's screwdriver. Be sure to lay all wiring and cables carefully over the end of the enclosure. Then remove the ground cable from the frame. Now remove the 2 screws that secure the electrical box. The electrical box can now be removed. The next step involves removal of the supply HEPA filter. Extra care should be taken during this step to prevent damage to the fragile filter. The filter media should never be touched or damage will occur. Using the 1/2-inch socket and ratchet, turn each of the plenum lift bolts clockwise to raise the plenum off of the supply HEPA filter. Do not attempt to turn each bolt the entire distance. Rather, work in a pattern, turning each bolt no more than 10 revolutions. Then move to the next. This will lift the plenum evenly. Repeat this pattern until the plenum is high enough to slide the HEPA filter free. Using 2 people, slide the supply HEPA filter out. Be very careful not to touch the media. It will damage easily. Set the filter on its long end, standing up, in a location that's safe from accidental contact. The plenum and blower and upper frame can be lifted off the top of the enclosure together. A minimum of 2 people are required for this step. Remove the 3 filter tabs by removing the screws on each. Turn the 4 plenum lift bolts counterclockwise until the plenum and blower assembly lowers and then is free from each lift bolt. Do not attempt to turn each bolt the entire distance. Work in a pattern, turning each bolt no more than 10 revolutions. Then move to the next. This will lower the plenum and blower evenly. Place 2 boards on the upper frame under the plenum, one at each end of the upper frame. Do this before the plenum is completely released. This will aid in the removal and reinstallation of the plenum and blower assembly. Open the front sash hatch and locate the 6 screws that secure the diffuser. Remove all 6 screws and the diffuser itself. Remove the screws that secure the upper frame in place. Using 2 people, lift the upper frame off the top of the enclosure. The logic view is now prepared to move through a low doorway. Once through the doorway, reassemble the parts in the reverse order. The logic view is 39.6 inches wide. To fit through a narrow door, it can be partially disassembled to reduce the product width to 35 inches. To prepare the logic view to pass through narrow doors, you'll need the following tools. A number 2 Phillips screwdriver. A drill is recommended. 5/16 inch wrench and nut driver. A 1/2 inch wrench and a 1/2 inch ratcheting socket. and a step ladder. First, remove the plate screws and cap plates from the top of the enclosure. Then lift off the top panel and pre-filter. Now remove the two top screws on the far right and left of the upper front panel. Continue by removing the three front screws on each end of the upper front panel. Then tilt the upper front panel away from the enclosure and lift the panel off. Repeat these instructions for the upper rear panel. Next, remove the upper end panels. Remove the two screws on each end panel. Rotate the top of each end panel away from the enclosure, then lift each panel up to completely remove. Note that two screws hold the pass-through cover in place, and this cover will come off when removing these screws. Remove the 8 screws on the top end panel. Rotate the top of the top end panel away from the enclosure. Then lift the panel up to completely remove it. Remove the 4 screws on the bottom end panel. And remove the bottom end panel. Repeat these instructions for the opposite end. Next, remove the sashes from the logic view. Rotate the lower sash fully open. Lock the sash retainer latches if desired. Rotate the front hatch fully open. Use one person to support the front hatch, while a second person removes the gas spring nut. Hold the gas spring stud stationary using the 1/2-inch wrench on the inside of the liner, while using the 1/2-inch socket and ratchet to loosen the nut. Repeat for gas spring nut on opposite end of the front hatch. Allow the gas springs to fully extend and close the front hatch slowly. Remove the 8 KEPS nuts and washers along the top of the front hatch. Using 2 people, lift the front hatch up to clear the threaded studs in the top of the liner. Set the front hatch aside. Repeat these instructions for the rear hatch. Be sure to tilt the display vertically using the adjustable locking handle located directly behind the screen. Next, detach the rear exhaust guard by removing the screws on the underside of the assembly. The logic view is now prepared to move through narrow doorways. Once through, reassemble the parts in the reverse order. Completing installation. Once the enclosure has been moved to its installation location, continue with the following steps to complete the installation. Remove any remaining tape from the sashes and work surface. Then open the front sash hatch and retrieve the white parts box on the top of the spill stopper work surface. This parts box will contain the following: 4 sash restraint latches, 4 screws, 4 leveling legs, a work surface removal tool, and 2 cable pass-through inserts. Install the sash restraint latches in the lowest set of the thread holes in the far left and right ends of the front and rear sash hatch. Install the screws in the upper set of threaded holes in the front and rear sash hatch. The enclosure can be set with the work surface height from 31.5 to 37.5 inches high, in 1-inch increments. Reference the user's manual for specific instructions on raising and lowering the working height. If the final installation location is not level, or if the site installation warrants the use of seismic restraints, the provided leveling feet must be installed. Proceed with wiring power to the Logic View in accordance with the manual and local code requirements. You've just completed the installation of your Logic View Class 2 biosafety enclosure from Labconco. Before initiating work, have the enclosure certified by a qualified certifier and ensure that all users are trained on the safe operation of the system.